Tracing the design is the single most important thing we can do. We always trace the design. Tracing the design will ensure that this design is going to fit within the hoop size that we have selected. We're going to watch the laser and make sure it stays within the area of the hoop, which will ensure that we don't accidentally hit a hoop and do any damage to our embroidery machine. To get into the trace, we hit the Ready function, and using the arrow keys, we go down to the function that we want to perform. There are two different kinds of trace that we can perform. We've got the Exclude Trace and the one simply labeled Trace. The difference between these two, the Exclude actually follows the shape of the design itself. The Trace will take the furthest left and right areas, the furthest top and bottom areas, and will form a rectangular box around the design. Because of that, the Exclude Trace is a much more accurate trace and is the one that we use about 99% of the time. That being said, why would we use the regular trace function? The regular trace comes in very handy when we're trying to line up above a pocket or on horizontal stripes of a shirt, because it'll take the lowest point of the design, it'll draw a horizontal line, and if we see that it's running parallel to the pocket or parallel to the stripes, we know that that hoop is lined up nice and square with that design. If it's not, we would rehoop the garment and redo the trace. Let's take a look at the Exclude Trace first. Using the arrow keys, I go down to Exclude, I press the Set button to go into that function, and you'll see it has actually calculated the perimeter points of that design. We now hit the Frame button to start the frame moving and turn the laser on so that we can make sure that that laser stays within the area of the hoop. On the screen, it's going around the design showing the actual trace, but that's not what you want to watch. You never want to watch the screen when you're doing the trace. You always want to look at the hoop. So let's look at that again. I hit Frame and we watch the hoop area. Make sure that the laser and the number one needle stays within the area of that hoop. And that fit without any problem at all. Now we have on here, besides that Frame button, the Save function. Let me just explain quickly what that's for. We don't use it most of the time. What that would do is it would actually save the perimeter points of the trace. Whenever you hit that Set button, it actually has to calculate all of those perimeter points. Now this design is just a little over 8,300 stitches, so that happens in a matter of seconds. If this were a 200,000 stitch jacket back design, that calculation may take 3, 4, 5 minutes. Well, we don't want to have to wait that time every single time we want to re-execute that trace. So by hitting the Save button, it stores that trace perimeter in the memory of the machine. To get out of the trace, I would simply hit the Escape button. It would bring me back to the main menu. Hit Escape again, and it brings me out entirely. Now let's take a look at the regular trace. We hit Ready to get into the menu, go down to Trace, press the Set button, and now press Start to execute the trace. You'll see this happens faster, but it's not nearly as accurate. But it's great for lining up above pockets and horizontal stripes. Again, we don't want to watch the screen. We always want to watch the hoop. To get out of that, we simply hit Escape, and that brings us out. Now let's take a look at doing the trace on a cap. We go into Ready. On a cap, we're always going to use Exclude. We hit Set to go into it. It calculates the perimeter points, and we hit Frame to execute the trace. You want to make sure you're looking at the cap, not looking at the computer screen. When we're tracing on a cap, the laser is not accurate. The laser works fine when we're doing flat things like shirts and sweatshirts, but it doesn't work on very thick items, and it definitely doesn't work on hats due to the fact that a hat never sits perfectly flat on the needle plate. It's always got a curve and it's raised slightly. So when I do the trace, I always like to take the presser foot and hold it down like this, then hit Frame and let it do the trace function. And I'm watching the number 1 needle and watching where that would line up on the hat. Remember, the number 1 needle is what's going to sew. Even if I'm not using the number 1 needle, whatever needle is over the needle plate, which in this case it happens to be number 1, that is where the machine is always going to sew from. Remember, when it does a color change, the head moves into a different needle position. Now, why am I holding it down like this? The reason why is because if I see I'm about to hit something, I can move my hand and it simply lets that presser foot kick back up. Once I know that that's going to fit in the right area, I will actually take the thread guide, which is this little piece of metal that the thread goes behind when we thread the machine, and I will actually pull this down until I hear it click or lock in place. Now I can really concentrate on watching that instead of sitting there holding it down. And clearly that design fits without any trouble. To get that needle back up, we would simply hit Escape on the control panel, hit Escape again to get out of the menu, and just pick a different needle number. So I'm on number 1, so if I simply hit 2, that'll let that needle kick up.